Today we continue the spa robe by knitting the sleeve. In this video, we'll knit the sleeve one way. That is from the top down, still using this yarn as for the rest of the project. Here's how the sleeve fits into the armhole, so you do need to sew your shoulder seams now before we begin. Use whatever kind of seam you like, but I actually prefer to sew the shoulder seams on a sewing machine, just as you would if you were sewing the entire garment on the machine. The reason being is that it makes the least bulky seam. The written pattern includes several versions of sleeve. They include wider, longer, top down, bottom up, and one for the king-queen version. That's too much for one video, so we'll just make this version today. This is a page from the written pattern. We begin by hanging the entire armhole with the wrong side, the purl side, in view, which will make the sleeve come out properly knitted into the armhole. We'll knit a few straight rows that will eventually align with the underarm bind-offs, then begin decreasing frequently on both sides, finish with some straight rows, and reform them as ribbing. When hanging the armhole, we'll hang on 81 needles, and it's super important that each needle go in its own unique opening in the fabric. There are more rows to work with than we need needles, so it's not a problem. Just watch for it. Hang the entire outer column of stitches, the edge column of stitches, and the result, if you get it just right, is a neat seam that looks like this. If two needles accidentally share one opening in the knitted fabric when hanging, a run that is very hard to fix will result. Now here this shoulder seam is sewn, and I hung that in the middle of the bed. The bottom of the armhole on the left, not the straight part where we bound off, but the bottom of the vertical sweep, is hung on needle 40 left. At the far right, the bottom of the other side of the armhole is hung on needle 41 right, making a total of 81 stitches is what we need. I find it best to begin hanging near the center, hang both ends, then divide up the openings, feeling for even tension all the way across the work. Keep on checking to make sure that your tool from which you are hanging goes right next to the edge column of stitches. That's what's been allowed for in the pattern, and that's the method that I find makes the neatest seam. When the entire sleeve area is hung as evenly as possible, that means the side of the armhole is hung on the machine, I'm going to set the machine to knit back from hole and just start knitting. If you're using a hobby machine, plastic bed, it may not want to do that. If so, just set it up so that you can knit back the first row manually by laying your yarn in the needle hooks and pulling back, and you'll eventually get the same result. But here comes my first row. Knit a total of 11 straight rows. That includes the very first one made after hanging the armhole of the main garment. Stop for the first decrease after row 11 with the carriage on the left, and using the two-prong tool, decrease once on each side. Do so again after row 12. Now decrease every other row until a total of 30 sleeve rows have been knitted, making the final decrease after knitting row 30. If you decrease at the pace I've just given you, the lower edge of the sleeve will be 14¼ inches in circumference. Since it's going to hit most of us just above the elbow, that's usually fine. If you would like it looser, make the same number of rows, but make fewer decreases. If you were to make decreases every 3 rows rather than every 2, you would add about 2 inches to the lower circumference of the sleeve. I plan to make knit 2, purl 1 ribbing just as I did on the hem, and I've got the needle set up to show you how that will work. If you preferred to, you could make knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. In either case, knit 10 rows. Because I don't want a dramatic pulling in, I did not reduce the stitch size. Ladder down every 3rd stitch for the 10 rows that we just knitted of straight knitting, latch it back up as a purl stitch, and then bind off. I prefer to bind off around the gate pegs using this machine. The transfer bind off will also be just fine, but make sure that it does not restrict the sleeve opening. You want to be able to get your arm in there easily. Experienced knitters can probably take it from here without further help, but in the next video, we will do the side seams, finish the sleeve into the armhole, and make the belt. And those of you who are able to go on and finish now, don't forget to send me pictures if you want them to be in the wrap-up movie. For newer knitters, this is called the full fashion decrease. It means more than one stitch is moved over. There are some style advantages that can be used to create subtle lines in the fabric, but that's not why we're using it here. When we only use a 2-stitch full fashion decrease, it has the beneficial effect of leaving a column of stitches at the edge of the fabric that does not have any doubled stitches on it. It's a normal column of stitches. That means that we can seam right next to that column of stitches using mattress stitch or back stitch, and we won't have to deal with the doubled stitches, which are much harder to work with. Well, the full fashion decrease is not at all difficult. It is a little bit trickier than just moving one stitch. So here are some tips. If you pull down a little bit on the edge of the fabric with the hand that is not holding the tool, it can be easier to get the tool to pick up those stitches. At times, you may need to use a fingertip or your thumb to flip open the latch manually. And you may want to use one hand to even up the needles so that they're aligned exactly side by side when they are to receive stitches. As with all skills involving dexterity, practice helps immensely.